So the question is about 3 different students who did the same experiment that you did. They set up an experimental sample with a sample of paint in it. They put some lead into a test tube to make a standard, and they left one sample without anything added to it to make the control. And in all the experiments, all the trials, they used the same filters, the same cups, and the same kind of test tubes that had the same kind of acid in them, so that those things were all constant. And these are the results that they saw in each of those tubes. So student number 1, they saw in their paint sample, the experimental sample, a yellow reaction. Student number 1 saw in the standard sample a yellow reaction. And student number 1 saw in the control sample that there was no reaction. And so we want to interpret what those results mean and what could have caused them. So student number 1, what could have caused the yellow reaction here in the experimental sample? Is it that there's lead in the paint? Is it lead in the constants? Or is it unknown? So I know that it's not caused by lead in the constants, that the materials used to do the experiment didn't have lead contamination. That's what the control tells me. The control used the same filters and cups and test tubes and acid as the other samples did, and since there was no reaction here, I can be sure that the experimental sample reaction is not caused by lead in the constants. So I know that for sure. And I know from the standard that there's a reaction when there's lead present. The only difference between the standard and the control, since they have the same cups and acid and tubes and filters, is that this one had lead added to it. So this reaction here must be explained by the thing that's different, that there's lead. So when I see that this one reacts the same way, that the paint reacts just like the lead does, I could conclude that the experimental sample reaction is caused by lead in the paint. It's not caused by lead in the constants. And so when I try to interpret the results, here's what I would say. I would say that the hypothesis is supported. We tested the hypothesis that the paint sample contains lead. There's lead in the paint, and that I can rule out that the materials used in the test were contaminated with lead. So number 1 supports the hypothesis. Student number 2 got different results. Put these away here. Let's see what student number 2 is up to. Student number 2 saw a reaction in the sample of paint, and saw a reaction with the standard, and saw a reaction with the control. And so now we want to figure out what can we say about student number 2's results. Was the experimental sample reaction right here caused by lead in the paint, lead in the constants, or unknown? Well, I'm looking over at the control and I see that there's a reaction. That means that there's something in there that reacts the same way as the lead that was put into the standard. Since the standard and the control are both made identically with the same materials except for one thing that's different, this one has lead added to it, they both react the same way. That must be because there was lead in the constants. So if there's lead here in the constants, then that's a possible explanation for why there's lead in the paint sample. So I don't know if it's not caused by lead in the paint. There may actually be lead in that paint sample, but I don't know for sure because I get the same result as the control. If there's lead in the paint or if there's not lead in the paint, I would still get the same result because the control shows me that the materials are already contaminated. So it could be caused by lead in the constants, and so my conclusion there is that the hypothesis is rejected. The experiment fails. I can't rule out that the materials were already contaminated with lead. The paint may have lead in it, but we can't tell for sure because the materials, you get the same reaction results no matter what. So let's look at student number 3. Student number 3 sees a reaction in the experimental sample with the paint and sees no reaction with the standard and sees no reaction with the control. And we want to know, is the experimental reaction here the result of lead in the paint lead in the constants, or unknown. So I'm looking at the constants, I don't see a reaction. So I can be pretty sure that it's not that there's lead in the constants. I can rule that out. This reaction wasn't caused by contaminated filters, cups, or tubes, or acid. Now this one right here is kind of a mystery, because if lead was put in there, there should have been a reaction, if lead reacts the way we think it does. But what if lead does not react the way we think it does? Then I don't know what caused this reaction to happen, because I have nothing to compare to that shows me what that reaction means. So the experimental sample reaction is of unknown explanation. I can't say why that one happened. I don't know what makes that reaction. If lead was really put in here, then maybe lead doesn't react the way that we think that it does. So student number 3 is going to have to reject the hypothesis, again because the experiment fails. There's no evidence that a positive result, that the yellow reaction is caused by lead. It could be anything. We don't know. The paint could have lead in it, but again, we can't tell for sure because we don't have a result that shows us that this makes a reaction with lead. So using that as your guide, you should be able to interpret the results that you'll get when you do the experiment with your paint sample.